Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 2 on the Free Motion Quilting Project. This week I want to continue to focus on stippling because this is such an essential design for free motion quilting, and it's the mother of all independent designs, the family that we're focusing on for the next couple of months. So this week let's talk about stippling in a real quilt or a large block. Basically, I'm going to show you two different ways that you can quilt. And of course, there's millions more ways, but this is just the two that we're going to start with. The first, and here's a photo of it, the first is a very random stitching. So I just started in the middle of this large square and I stitched in all different directions, branching out, wiggling around, with no real rhyme or reason to it. I'll be honest, I don't like this form of quilting simply because it's very easy to stitch yourself into a corner, and it's also kind of time consuming because you're always changing direction, you don't really know where you're going. It's kind of like driving somewhere without using a map to get there. You get lost a lot. The second version of stippling, as far as using it on a real quilt, is this one, and it is filling that block using rows. And while it might not look like it in this particular picture, I actually went from the center to the edge, back from the edge to the center, back and forth, and then started working my way back up into the center until my bobbin ran out. So let's watch the video and see how both of these blocks were filled and try and apply that to how you quilt a real quilt.
So the first thing you're going to do is use your hand wheel to drop your needle into the bobbin, pull up that bobbin thread and tuck both of the threads underneath your quilting foot. And you're going to see me do that a lot this year because if you leave your bobbin thread on the bottom, it's just going to get stitched to the back of your quilt. It's going to look really bad and you'll have to pick it out and it's a real pain. So it's a really good habit to get into the habit of. So here you can see I'm just stitching very randomly. I'm just making these kind of wiggly stippling shapes. You'll probably recognize several of these shapes from last week. I'm just taking those and combining them together. And it's really a pattern that is very individual for everybody, different for everybody. How you combine those together, what you feel comfortable with. The more you're going to stitch it, the more you will feel comfortable with a pattern, a set of shapes and angles to stitch in. And everybody, has a different one. But here I am stitching this very randomly. And you can see it really has no rhyme or reason to it. I might stitch in one direction for a little while and then turn around and stitch in another direction for a little while. And to be honest, it's not really very fluid, simply because you don't know where you're going. You're just kind of going wherever the whim takes you, and that's okay. That works for some people. I will also say, having shot this video and being able to compare the length between both practice quilt sandwiches, I quilted about the same amount on both. This one took twice as long. So stitching randomly is more time consuming. And of course I've had to speed up the video just so you can see more of it. And because I'm stitching randomly, I'm going to have to rotate the quilt a lot more often, moving it around so that way I can get a good angle. At any point in time, if you're quilting and it just feels like you're struggling with the quilt, you're struggling to make a nice movement, then you need to rotate the quilt and maybe you'll be able to get those nice stitches again. And the reason that you couldn't is just simply because you're feeling a little uncomfortable with that particular angle. So the aim with this video is to show you how I fill a quarter of a quilt. And we are using our imagination a little bit since this is only a 24-inch block. And I'm stitching this on a 1/2 inch scale. So there's about a 1/2 of an inch between those lines of quilting. And you might think that that's a little dense, but it's actually not. It's very soft. So that pretty much finishes up those stitching randomly part of our afternoon today. So now let's try the opposite style. Let's try quilting in rows. And again, this is much faster. I quilted this sample in about 5 minutes, the other sample in about 10. And truthfully, I think I filled more of the block in this sample simply because I knew where I was going, I knew how to get there, and I knew what was next. I always knew what was next. And so the process is basically just stitching from the center to the edge. and I'm stitching about a 2-inch row here. And the nice thing is it's a lot more like what we did last week, what we were working on last week, and that is just stitching the same pattern over and over again. And if you want to, you can stick with that. Just stitch the same set of shapes over and over again. But eventually you'll want to get to the point where you can start combining shapes together and making a more complex row so that it doesn't look like it's all just, the random U shapes stacked on top of each other. It's actually something a little different. So here I've gotten to the edge of my quilting space, and I'm going to keep that row going, just stitching down a little bit, and then I'm going to stitch right back to the middle, kind of interlocking this row with the first row. I want to make these wiggly shapes more or less, kind of not really touch. You don't want them to touch, but you want them to kind of nest into one another and butt into each other. If there's a little pocket of space, like right there, I'm going to stitch into that little pocket of space with a little wiggly shape. So that way they're kind of nested together, and it's not obvious that that's the way I'm stitching my quilt. Does it matter if it's obvious? No, not at all. It doesn't matter a single bit, because your quilt's still going to look awesome. But it's one of those things that a lot of people really don't want to, they want to look at stippling and they want it to just look like it's one, big mass of wiggles, not obviously stitched in rows. So here I've gotten back into the middle of the quilt, and again I'm going to stitch down a little bit and start a new row, working from the center to the edge again. And this is working this way, working to fill a quarter of your quilt in this pattern. I call it quadrant quilting. You don't necessarily have to always stitch in quadrants. The more I work with rows, the more I'm finding, you can take that row and you can stitch it in circles around your quilt. You can take that row and you can stitch straight lines across your quilt. I'm breaking down some of the rules, the hard and fast rules of quilting, simply because some of them aren't necessary. Sometimes we have to look at rules and say, okay, well, what can be broken here and what absolutely has to stay? And knowing that so many quilters have so many different opinions about so much of this stuff, spray basting versus pen basting, for example. I mean, people have practically gone to war over less. But the simple fact is, everybody has different methods, and it's worth trying them and to understand that there's more than one way of doing something. So I'm showing you quadrant quilting here, but of course you could take these rows and apply them in many different areas. You could take this 2-inch row and put it in your quilt sashing. So don't feel limited to only stitch from the middle to the edges. You can do a lot more with this, and I'm going to show you more that you can do with rows in more videos, hopefully coming up this year.
So I hope this video has helped you see there's a lot of different ways that you can fill your quilt with stippling, and depending on the way your mind and your brain works, one way might work better for you. If randomly stitching the design in any old direction works great for you, go for that. But if you might be the other type of personality where you really want to have a logical progression to your quilt, make sure to start in the center and play with this week coming up with a very comfortable row. Everyone has a different width that they like to play with. Personally, for this quilt, I stuck with about 2-inch wide row. When I'm working on a bigger scale though, I go from somewhere to about 3 to 4 inches wide. So just play with that this week. Make yourself up some practice sandwiches and work just simply in a row with a more complex version of stippling, and then come on around and try and interlock that row with the next row so that it's not very obvious that that's what you're doing. At the same time, also play with stitching randomly. Play with that, because every once in a while you'll get a weird shaped quilt, like this quilt covered in big circles. You might end up with a quilt like this, and you kind of have to stitch it a little randomly in order to wiggle your way around all those circles or shapes. So I hope that this is an interesting thing to work on this week. Of course, if you have a real quilt that you want to play with this on, pull it out and play with it. Stitch randomly through one half of it and stitch in rows through the other half of it. Figure out which one flows more easily and works more easily for your body and your mind. If you find yourself getting very confused and very frustrated, chances are that is not the way that's going to work best for you. So that's it for this quilt along video. please link up your post, whatever you shared on your blog about the quilt along, and link that up in the bottom of this post. You'll see a button that you can click on to do that. And ask any questions, ask for help, and list any concerns that you have about stitching out the very simple versions of stippling that we did last week. So until next time, let's go quilt.
If you saw any tools or materials in this video for free motion quilting that you're interested in, check out our online quilt shop at daystyledesigns.com.